A black student speaks a truth his classroom isn't ready to hear, and it changes everything. A faded photograph, an unexpected journey, and a lesson neither student nor teacher will ever forget. This isn't just a story about injustice, it's the story of a voice powerful enough to wake an entire classroom. The first time Jamal Rivers spoke in Mr. Langston's class, the room didn't just go quiet, it paused like it wasn't quite sure what to do with what it had just heard. It was Tuesday morning at Lakehurst High, second period English Lit, and the assignment had been simple: discuss the recurring theme of justice in To Kill a Mockingbird. Most kids had stuck to the script, something about fairness, courtroom drama, or Atticus being noble. But when it was Jamal's turn, he didn't recite. He spoke. Calmly, clearly, he said, "What I see is a story about a system built to protect itself. And the way Tom Robinson gets treated, that's not fiction for people who look like me. That's a reflection." It wasn't angry, it wasn't loud. It was just honest. And maybe that's what made it land like it did. The room shifted. Eyes turned. A few eyebrows raised. And then, from the front of the room, came the sound that would change everything, a low chuckle. Mr. Langston. Early 50s, khaki pants, stiff collar. A man who started every class with a quote from Hemingway and liked his classroom neat and his history neater. He leaned back in his chair, folded his arms, and said, "Let's try to stick to the actual text, Jamal. Not everything has to be a political statement." A few students laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was safe. Jamal just blinked. Didn't flinch. Didn't argue. But something behind his eyes shifted, like a window being slowly closed. He didn't speak for the rest of the class. He didn't have to. His silence said enough. The bell rang 20 minutes later, and backpacks zipped, sneakers squeaked on tile, conversation swelled as everyone filed out into the hallway. Jamal packed his things slowly, careful, deliberate, until only he and Mr. Langston remained. The teacher didn't look up right away. He scribbled something in his notebook, clicked his pen twice, then finally spoke. "Rivers," he said, without warmth or hostility, just formality. "Stay a moment." Jamal paused, his backpack slung over one shoulder. "Yes, sir?" Mr. Langston opened a drawer and pulled out a manila envelope, no label, no name, just thick from whatever it held inside. He placed it on the desk between them, then looked up. "Take this. Open it when you get home. And then, come back tomorrow and tell me if you still think you're right." There was no explanation, no instruction beyond that. Just a raised eyebrow and a subtle challenge in the air, like a glove being thrown without ever touching the ground. Jamal reached for the envelope, his fingers brushing the edge like it might bite. "What is it?" he asked. Mr. Langston didn't blink. "Perspective." Jamal nodded once, slid the envelope into his backpack, and walked out without another word. The hallways were loud now, full of slamming lockers and inside jokes and the smell of cafeteria pizza warming too early. But Jamal barely heard it. His mind was still in that classroom, replaying the way Mr. Langston said political statement like it was a bad word. Like truth wasn't welcome if it came dressed in the wrong voice. That night, he sat on his bed, the envelope unopened beside him. His room was quiet, walls covered with sketches of jazz musicians, protest posters, and a timeline of black inventors he'd made in 8th grade that no teacher had ever asked for but he kept anyway. His mom worked late shifts at the hospital, and his little sister, Amaya, was asleep down the hall. He had time. He stared at the envelope for a long moment before finally tearing it open. Inside was a single black and white photograph. An old white woman, sitting on a porch swing, staring straight into the camera like she knew exactly who would be looking at her one day. Her hair was pulled back, her clothes plain, but her eyes, they were steel. Not unkind, but unmoving. On the back of the photo, in careful handwriting, were 8 words: "Her name is Maeve Whitaker. Go talk to her." Jamal frowned. No address. No phone number. Just a name and a look that felt heavier than the picture itself. He set the photo on his desk, then leaned back in his chair, trying to understand what game Mr. Langston was playing. Was this a punishment? A test? Or something else entirely? The next day in class, Mr. Langston didn't say a word about the envelope. Didn't mention the photo. He just started class like nothing had happened, quoting Steinbeck and assigning a chapter review. Jamal said nothing too. But his mind kept going back to those eyes, the ones in the photograph that looked like they'd seen everything and forgotten nothing. He'd never heard the name Maeve Whitaker before. But he was about to. And what she would show him, well, Mr. Langston wasn't wrong. It was perspective. Just not the kind he expected. He stared at the photo for hours that night, long after the house had gone quiet, long after the neighborhood settled into its usual stillness. The porch swing, the sharpness in her eyes, the way her hands rested calmly in her lap like she'd seen the worst of this world and dared it to come at her again. Jamal didn't know who Maeve Whitaker was, but something in that image told him she wasn't someone you ignored. The next morning, he didn't tell his mom where he was going. He just left a note on the kitchen counter, going to meet someone for school. Don't worry. He caught the 7:40 bus headed south, then transferred twice until the buildings got smaller and the sidewalks disappeared. The city bled into fields, fields into woods, and finally into a quiet row of aging houses sitting heavy under the weight of history and moss. He stepped off the last bus and followed the directions Mr. Langston had written, just an address scrawled beneath the name like it wasn't something precious. But it was. By the time he reached the house, Jamal was sweating through his hoodie, backpack bouncing with every step, nerves simmering just beneath his ribs. The house was small, wooden, with peeling blue paint and a screen door that hung slightly off-center. A wind chime swayed in the breeze, the sound sharp and metallic. He hesitated on the porch, then knocked. Nothing. He knocked again. This time the door creaked open a sliver and one pale, deeply lined eye peered out. Yes? The voice was firm, clipped. Jamal cleared his throat. Are you? Miss Whitaker? She opened the door just enough to see him properly. Her gray hair was tied back in a loose knot, and she wore a faded cardigan over a cotton dress. Her eyes were just like the photo, sharp, assessing, like they weighed you before you even spoke. I might be. Who's asking? My name's Jamal Rivers. Derek Langston sent me. For a second, her expression didn't change. Then she pushed the screen door open and stepped aside. Well, that man still sending kids to my porch? I figured he'd finally stop trying. Jamal stepped inside slowly. The house smelled like lemon polish and old paper. Books lined every wall. Some stacked on floors, tables, windowsills, titles about law, race, poetry, war. Maeve walked ahead of him, slow but steady, until she reached a worn armchair by the window. She sank into it like it knew her. Sit, she said, gesturing to the faded floral couch opposite her. Jamal sat. She didn't speak at first, just studied him like a relic in a museum. He shifted in his seat, unsure what he was supposed to say. You quiet, she said finally. Good. Most people talk too much. So what did Langston tell you? Not much, Jamal admitted. Just gave me your photo. Said to talk to you. Then asked myself if I still think I'm right. She snorted. That sounds like Derek. She reached to the side table and pulled out a worn folder. I suppose he thinks I'll change your mind. About what? About your comment, she said. Whatever it was that made him uncomfortable enough to send a student my way. Jamal hesitated, then said, I said that the justice system in the book we were reading didn't feel like fiction to me. That it felt like, now. She didn't flinch. And he laughed? Said it was political. Said we should focus on the text. She shook her head slowly. They always say focus on the text when the truth makes them uncomfortable. She opened the folder and pulled out an old newspaper article. The paper had yellowed with time, edges soft and frayed. She handed it to him. The headline read, "Local Librarian Banned After Curriculum Protest." Underneath, a photo, a younger version of her, standing with a sign in front of a small-town library. Behind her, a pile of books smoldered in a metal bin. She was alone. Jamal looked up. "That's you." "That's me," she said. 1964, Alabama. They wanted to remove every book by a black author from the school library. I said no. So they banned me from stepping foot on public property. "You got arrested?" "3 times, she said flatly. "Once for holding a read-in. Once for harboring kids running from violence. Once for speaking too loudly at a board meeting." You'd be surprised how easy it is to get arrested when you're a woman telling the truth in a room full of men who don't want to hear it. Jamal sat in stunned silence. "Why didn't you stop?" "Because if I had, they would have won. And I'd be sitting on this porch today having to explain why I didn't fight harder. I couldn't live with that." She leaned forward, her eyes locking on his. "You spoke up in class, didn't you? Told the truth?" He nodded slowly. "Then you already know why I didn't stop." Jamal swallowed the lump in his throat. "You said Langston sends students here?" "Only a few," she said. "When one of them says something that shakes his world just enough, he sends them here to make sense of it. I think he hopes I'll humble you. What I try to do is hand you the rest of the story." She gestured to the books behind her. "We carry memory in our bones, but also in our words. You got people in your life who make you feel like telling the truth is dangerous?" "Sometimes," he said. "You keep telling it anyway." She reached for another folder, thinner, sealed. "Take this. Inside's a note. A place. You'll go there next. If you're serious." Jamal looked at her, eyes wide. "Where is it?" "Montgomery. Legacy Museum. You go there, and you don't go as a tourist. You go as someone looking to see what they've tried to bury." She stood slowly, joints cracking. Jamal stood too, taking the envelope with a reverence he didn't expect. "Thank you," he said. She nodded once. "Go make them listen, Jamal Rivers. Loud isn't always volume. Sometimes it's just refusing to vanish." Jamal left the house carrying more than a folder. He carried names. Stories. Silence broken. The next morning, he sat on a Greyhound bound for Montgomery, sitting near the back. Notebook in his lap. The museum was quiet when he arrived. Cool air, white walls, dark floor. The kind of space where even your footsteps felt too loud. And everywhere, images. Names. Voices. The wall of jars filled with soil from lynching sites. The mugshots of children. A burned church door. The grainy photo of 4 little girls from Birmingham. He stopped in front of a display, Addie Mae Collins. Age 14. Killed in the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing. Just a child. Jamal didn't cry. He didn't look away. He just stood there, letting it burn its place into his memory. In another room, quotes etched into stone walls. "The opposite of poverty is not wealth. The opposite of poverty is justice." His hands trembled as he wrote. Page after page. Reflections. Questions. Truths he'd never been taught in school. And somewhere between the exhibit on mass incarceration and the one about enslaved children being sold like livestock, he stopped seeing Langston as the enemy. He saw him as a man with walls of his own. Brick by brick, built over years of comfort and silence. But Jamal wasn't interested in knocking them down with anger. He was going to climb over them. And when he stood at the top, he'd reach back for the next kid behind him. That night, on the bus ride home, Jamal opened his notebook again. He started writing not just what he'd seen, but what it meant. What it changed. And by the time they pulled back into the city limits, he was no longer the quiet new kid at Lakehurst High. He was something else entirely. He was a mirror. And the next time Mr. Langston looked at him, he'd have to decide whether to finally see what was there, or keep pretending the reflection didn't matter. He didn't sleep much the night he got back from Montgomery. His body was tired, but his mind wouldn't quit, spinning with names, dates, faces etched into stone, and voices that still seemed to echo inside him long after he left the museum. Jamal sat at his desk just past 2 a.m., the soft hum of the streetlight leaking through his window as he flipped through page after page of notes he'd scribbled on the bus ride home. His handwriting was messy, rusted in places, but the words were alive, for girls. Church bomb. Age 11. 14, 13. My sister is 13. Another page, legacy isn't history. It's now. Still now. Right now. And again, if truth makes people uncomfortable, maybe it's doing its job. By the time the sun began to stretch its fingers across the horizon, Jamal had stopped writing. He wasn't preparing a speech. He wasn't memorizing quotes. He was building a voice. Not a louder one, but one that couldn't be ignored. Monday morning came, and with it, the usual sounds of locker doors slamming, sneakers scuffing, and voices spilling over one another in the hallway like always. But Jamal walked into Langston's classroom with a silence wrapped around him like armor. He was early. On purpose. Mr. Langston looked up from his desk as he entered. He didn't say anything, just gave the faintest nod, the kind you offer when you're not quite sure what to say but know something's coming. Jamal sat in his usual seat near the window, pulled out his journal, and rested it on the desk in front of him. Other students filed in, loud and distracted, until the bell finally rang and Langston stood to begin the lesson. But before he could speak, Jamal raised his hand. Just a quiet lift, no urgency, no drama. Mr. Langston paused. The room did too. Yes, Jamal? The class turned toward him, some already smirking, expecting another awkward back and forth, maybe another tense moment like the one last week. But Jamal didn't speak immediately. He opened his journal, flipped past scribbled pages, and began reading. His voice wasn't raised. It was steady. I used to think my voice didn't matter here. That speaking up would only make people uncomfortable, or worse, make me a target. So I stayed quiet, because silence was easier than being ignored. But silence is just agreement with comfort. And I'm done being quiet. The class was dead still now. Even the kids who usually whispered in the back had their eyes locked on him. I went to Montgomery this weekend, he continued. I saw jars of soil collected from where people were lynched. I saw church shoes from girls no older than my little sister. I read letters written by men who never got to watch their sons grow up. And I realized something: we treat history like it lives in museums. But it lives here too. In this room. In the books we choose. The voices we silence. The truths we skip because they make us uncomfortable. He flipped to a fresh page. Mr. Langston, when I answered your question last week, I wasn't trying to be political. I was telling the truth. I was speaking from where I live, from what I've seen. And when you laughed, when you told me to stick to the text, I realized the text wasn't the problem. The lens was. The air was thick now, like every breath came with weight. Mr. Langston didn't move. Didn't blink. Just stood there, his posture less rigid than usual. Jamal closed his journal. Truth shouldn't have to dress itself up to be allowed in the room. If it makes us uncomfortable, maybe that means we're finally paying attention. For a long moment, no one spoke. And then something happened that Jamal hadn't expected. Not applause. Not gasps. Just stillness. Respectful. Listening. Mr. Langston slowly walked back to his desk, sat down, and looked at Jamal the way you look at something you've finally decided to see clearly. Thank you, he said softly. That was it. No lecture. No defensive speech. Just a man whose view had started to shift. After class, the students shuffled out slowly, some stealing glances at Jamal. A few nodded, one clapped him on the back. But no one said much. And for once, that silence felt right. Like it belonged to something bigger than a hallway of teenagers. Jamal waited until the last person left. Then he walked to Mr. Langston's desk and pulled something from his backpack. It was the article Maeve Whitaker had given him. The one with the photo of her standing alone in front of a burning book bin. He placed it gently on the desk. "She fought for a classroom that includes all of us," Jamal said. "And now I will too." Mr. Langston looked down at the article, his fingers brushing the edges like he was afraid to tear it. "Then you just might become the teacher I never had the courage to be," he said quietly. Jamal didn't respond. He didn't need to. He just nodded once and turned to leave. As he stepped into the hallway, the noise returned, lockers, laughter, life. But it didn't weigh him down anymore. Because now he wasn't walking through it as someone invisible. He was walking through it in truth. With a story. A voice. And a purpose that reached beyond a classroom. That night, back in his room, Jamal sat by the window, the stars just beginning to break through the haze of city light. He opened his notebook one last time and wrote, "I don't want to be right. I want to be real. I want to be part of the voice that changes the story, not just for me, but for whoever comes next." And he meant every word. Because what he'd learned from Maeve, from Montgomery, and even from Mr. Langston, was that the fight wasn't about shouting louder. It was about standing firm when others looked away. It was about holding the door open when someone else slammed it shut. It was about carrying a history that didn't just belong in textbooks, but in conversations, in classrooms, in courage. Jamal didn't know what would come next, how long it would take to truly change the way things worked at Lakehurst High. But he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't done. Not even close. Because now he wasn't just a student. He was a witness. And witnesses don't stay silent. They speak. They write. They remember. And they make sure the next person isn't walking into that classroom alone. What you just heard wasn't just a story about a student and a teacher, it was a story about truth, perspective, and what happens when someone dares to speak in a room designed to keep them silent. Jamal Rivers didn't raise his voice to be heard. He raised it to be understood. And in doing so, he reminded all of us that the fight for justice doesn't always happen on picket lines or courtroom steps. Sometimes, it happens in quiet classrooms, with nothing more than a notebook and the courage to say, "This matters." One of the most powerful lessons from Jamal's journey is that truth doesn't need permission. It doesn't have to be loud or flashy. It doesn't wait for approval. It simply waits for someone brave enough to carry it into the light. And more often than not, that someone is young, underestimated, and standing at the back of the room. We live in a world where it's easier to avoid uncomfortable conversations than to face them. Where people like Mr. Langston, educated, respected, and well-meaning, can still carry blind spots that shape the way they teach, lead, and judge. But when those blind spots are met with grace, honesty, and persistence, change becomes possible. Not instant. Not perfect. But possible. To the young people listening, never let someone else's doubt define your voice. Your story has power, even when others try to shrink it. Speak with courage, listen with humility, and walk in the truth that others worked hard for you to inherit. And to the adults, the educators, the parents, stay open. Stay teachable. You're not too old to learn, and sometimes the most important lessons come from the very students you think you're teaching. We want to thank you for spending time with us here at U.S. Justice Story. This channel exists because we believe stories like Jamal's need to be told and heard. If this story made you reflect, made you feel, or even made you a little uncomfortable in the right way, then we've done our job. Please consider subscribing, sharing this story with someone who needs it, and joining us for more powerful narratives that challenge injustice, celebrate courage, and honor the voices too often ignored. Thank you for listening. Thank you for believing. And remember, when you choose to speak up, even in a room that wasn't built for you, you are not just making noise. You're making history.